It was rather significant that this morning the opening song that we sang was taken from the 15th chapter of Exodus, the song of triumph that Moses and the people of Israel sang after they'd crossed through the Red Sea and then watched the waters come back and cover their Egyptian pursuers. The passage that I'm going to read this morning follows on immediately after that incident. The next thing that happened was that the prophetess Miriam took out a tambourine and led all the Israelite women in dancing and praise on the sands of the Red Sea. And I think sometimes we read words and don't sufficiently picture what's involved, but conservative estimates place the number of the people of Israel at that time at 2.5 million, which means there must have been close on 1 million women capable of dancing. And I think the sight of 1 million women praising the Lord, well, I mean, it really boggles the imagination. It's hard to conceive what that would be like. Incidentally, we also tend to overlook the age of the people involved. As I understand it, the prophetess Miriam at that time was 84 years old, at least. So, none of you have reached retiring age here this morning. And I think there's one thing that helps to keep you young. It's praising the Lord. And praising the Lord in a pretty active way. All right, I'm going to read now the next incident. It's remarkable how God deals with His people. There come moments of pressure, moments of tremendous difficulty, then great victories, moments of triumph and praise. And we tend to take the attitude, well, now everything's settled, that's it. No more problems. But how many of you know it doesn't work out that way? And just after the tremendous victory, about 3 days later, you're facing a completely new problem, one that you never imagined could come in your life. And this is how it was with the children of Israel. I'm reading now in Exodus 15, beginning at verse 22. I'm reading the King James Version because in some of the particular points that I want to bring out, it happens it's much closer to the original than the modern translations. That isn't always true, but it is in this particular passage. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. So after this great deliverance and victory, when it seemed all their problems were finally solved, they went 3 days in a wilderness, men, women, children, cattle, all that they had, without any water. And then they came to water. They saw a pool of water. But this was a bitter disillusionment. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah, which in Hebrew means bitter. Can you imagine the feelings of the people after 3 days without any supply of water? They come to a pool of water, stoop down to drink, and find that it's too bitter for them to swallow. Now, in that situation, what would you have done? You don't have to answer. I'm kind to think that some of you would have done what they did, which was complain. That's right. As a matter of fact, it seems to me about 2 million people complained, and one man had the sense to pray. And the man who prayed got the answer. Complaining never gets you an answer. It's just wasted energy. And the people murmured or complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Moses cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. You find that, for instance, the New International Version says a piece of wood. What you have to understand is that in Hebrew, the word tree is used of a tree while it's growing, but it's used of the same wood after it's cut down. There happens to be at least one other language that I had to learn at one time of which that's true. When I was in East Africa, in Kenya, in educational work, the general language used amongst the people there was Swahili. And in the Swahili language, there's a word for tree. It's mti. I don't suppose there's anybody here that knows Swahili. You'd be surprised because it's got around a lot. The word mti means a tree when it's standing up and when it's growing, when it's cut down. So if you were going to build a log house, you'd build it out of trees. They wouldn't be growing trees, they'd be cut down trees. This is true in Hebrew. So the Lord showed Moses a tree. Whether it was growing when he saw it or not, we don't know. But if so, he had to cut it down. And when he cast this tree into the waters were made sweet. It does not say the tree made the water sweet. In fact, I really don't believe the tree did make the water sweet. God made the water sweet, but casting the tree in was the act of faith that released the miracle-working power of God in those waters. You see, generally speaking, any miracle is triggered by an act of faith, something very simple. Doesn't have to be very complex. One of the ministries in which this is very apparent is the ministry of Elisha. Every time Elisha had a problem, he did something apparently silly, but it solved the problem. For instance, he was with a group of people and they were eating some food and they discovered it was poisonous. And they were all going to be dead if they didn't do something. And he just said, bring me some meal, some flour. He threw the flour into the pot and the food was all right. Now the flour didn't make the food all right. But that simple act triggered the miracle-working power of God which made the food all right. Then another time, he was near the city of Jericho, and those of you who've ever made a tour to Israel have always been shown this place. And there was a spring of water there, but the water was bad. It didn't make the ground fruitful. It was kind of bitter or saline water. And so they said to Elisha, we like the place, it's a beautiful place, but the water's no good. And Elisha said, bring me a cruse of salt. And he threw the salt into the water. And when the salt entered the water became sweet, drinkable. And it still is today. Every tour group is taken to see what they call Elisha's spring. So for something like 2,700 years, that testimony has stood of what happened when Elisha threw the salt into the water. But the salt didn't make the water drinkable. In fact, salt never makes water drinkable, does it? But it was the act of faith that released the miracle-working power of God into the water. And another occasion with Elisha, he and the sons of the prophets were down on the bank of the Jordan. They were cutting down trees to build a house, an extension to the Bible school. And one man had a loose axe head on the shaft of his axe, and as he was using it, the axe head flew off, fell into the water, and sunk to the bottom of the Jordan. And now, if you've ever been in the Jordan, you'll know that it's a very muddy river. It's probably got about 3 or 4 inches of soft black mud at the bottom. So it didn't just lie on the sandy bed of the river, but it sunk right down into the mud, and there was no way to recover it. So the young man came to Elisha. He said, I've got a real problem. I was using this axe, and it isn't even mine. It was borrowed, and now I've lost it. And Elisha said, give me a little piece of wood. And they gave him a piece of wood. He threw it into the river, and the axe head came up and floated on the surface. Now, the piece of wood didn't make the axe head float, but throwing in the piece of wood released the miracle-working power of God, which made the axe head come to the surface. You think that's out of date? No, it isn't. Jim Croft and I have a friend, Silas Owiti. I don't know why it comes to my mind to tell you this story, and I've got to be rather careful how I relate it, because life in East Africa is in some respects a little more crude than it is in the United States. Anyhow, Silas Owiti is a precious black brother, a member of the Luo tribe in western Kenya, one of the most faith-inspiring and godly men that I know. And a good many years back, probably in the early 1950s, he was sovereignly brought to the Lord in a very supernatural way. I don't think I'll go into the details of that. And after he came to the Lord, sort of fountain of faith was released in him. And things began to happen. And he himself told me this story. He was comparatively poor, but an Indian friend. There are in East Africa, there are Indians, there are Africans, there are white people. An Indian friend lent him a rather expensive fountain pen. And he was carrying this fountain pen in his pocket, and he went to the bathroom, if you can call it a bathroom, to the toilet. In Swahili they call it a choo, and it's not a water closet. It's just a deep, deep hole in the ground. And while he was there, the pen slipped out of his pocket and into the hole. Now, what would you do? Well, he did what Elisha did. He just got down a little piece of wood, threw it in, up came the pen. Now, I believe every word Silas ever to. He's the most honest man I know. See? So when you have a problem next time, remember there's a simple act of faith that can release the miracle-working power of God. Faith without works is dead. See, if you don't do anything, you don't have faith. I often find when I've prayed for people with arthritis, I know they're healed, but they don't know they are. So I say, now look, you can sit there forever in that chair, you'll never know you're healed. Get up and walk. And sometimes they look at you incredulously. But the moment they start to act, the miracle-working power of God is manifested. So here's a deep scriptural principle that we found early on in the Bible. When you have a problem that you can't resolve, but you want the miracle-working power of God to move in on that situation, God will show you a very simple act of faith that will release the power of God into that situation. So going on at verse 25, Moses cried unto the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. Another thing strikes me there is that if you're going to act in faith, you've got to let it be known. I don't know whether it's ever struck you that God told Moses to throw the tree into the water. I can picture some people who didn't have total faith would have said, well, I'll see if this thing works. So I'll wait till it's dark and I'll tiptoe down to the edge of the water and I'll just slide the tree in. And if it doesn't work, nobody will know I ever tried. God didn't approve that method. He said, you stand there in full view of everybody and look like an idiot. That's right. There's nothing that inhibits our faith more than the fear of looking foolish. Isn't that right? And a lot of times people will not move out in faith because they think, I might look a fool. But Moses was willing to look a fool. He took this piece of wood, this tree trunk, threw it into the water with a splash. Everybody could see, everybody could hear, but the result was everybody could drink. Now, God used that incident to teach Israel a deep truth about healing. Then it says, going on in verse 25, there he, the Lord, made for them a statute and an ordinance. A statute is a kind of regulatory law as to how their life was to be conducted as a people. An ordinance is a particular way of doing things. Who can think of an ordinance in the New Testament church? I know of at least 3 ordinances, 3 prescribed ways of doing things in the New Testament church. One is water baptism. There's a prescribed way of admitting people into the fellowship of God's people. baptizing them in water. One is the Lord's Supper. That's an ordinance. There's a prescribed way for God's people to meet together and feed in spirit on the body and blood of the Lord and proclaim that covenant in the blood of Jesus. And the third is anointing the sick with oil. James 5:14, is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the church. Let them anoint him with oil in the name of the Lord. Now there's another example of an act of faith. No one suggests that the oil heals the sick any more than the tree healed the water. But it's an ordinance. It's a specific way of doing things which proclaims your faith and releases the miracle working power of God into that situation. So you see, under the old covenant with Israel, there were many statutes, many ordinances. Life was pretty complicated. Almost everything was governed by some kind of an ordinance. In the New Testament church, the situation is somewhat different. There's a much greater measure of liberty. There's much less prescribed action. But there are certain statutes and ordinances for us also in the New Covenant. Now this was the statute and the ordinance. Verse 26, the Lord said, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do what is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Let's look at that last statement first. I am the Lord that healeth thee. In Hebrew, the word that healeth thee is precisely the word in modern Hebrew for a doctor. So if the Lord was speaking modern Hebrew, what he would be saying is, I am the Lord, your doctor. It's got as precise a meaning as that. It doesn't have a spiritual meaning. It has a physical meaning. God specifically reveals himself to his people as our doctor. I wonder whether we've really absorbed the full impact of that revelation. I am the Lord, your doctor. Israel didn't ask for this revelation. God himself sovereignly gave it to them. God determined to be the doctor of his people. He determined to take responsibility for their physical health. It's very clear that the whole import of it is physical, because he says, I will not permit any of the diseases of Egypt to come upon you. We're not talking in the spiritual frame at all. The whole thing is on the physical level. God said, if you will accept me as your doctor, I will preserve you from all the sicknesses that you saw for so many years in Egypt. And those of us that have been in Egypt, and I spent 2 years in Egypt, I doubt whether there's any major sickness that isn't represented in Egypt. If ever there was a country of sicknesses, it's Egypt. So when God said, you remember all the sicknesses you saw in Egypt, I won't allow any of them to come upon you. I am your doctor. Now, there is no human doctor that would ever dare to make that claim. Isn't that true? Thank God for good doctors. But I don't know a single doctor that could say to his patients, if you will let me take charge of your case, all these diseases will never come upon you. You see, I don't think we fully appreciate what God is saying to us. I think we tend to approach the Bible with our own preconceptions. We got a kind of idea of how far we think God might be prepared to go, and after that, well, we'll do our best. I didn't really relate in my testimony last night how the Lord taught me about divine healing. At least I didn't go into it in detail. I did quote that verse in Proverbs 4:20 through 22. My son, attend to my words, incline thine ear unto my sayings, let them not depart from thine eyes, keep them in the midst of thine heart, Those words are very close to what the Lord said here to Israel. Let me read these words again. He said, if. Some people just pass by that little word if. God says, I will do so-and-so if you will do so-and-so. And after a while it doesn't work, and we say to God, well, you didn't do so-and-so. And God says, you forgot the little if. If you will do so-and-so, then I will do so-and-so. Now God says, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God. The phrase diligently hearken in Hebrew is a repetition of the word listen, which is one of the ways that Hebrew emphasizes a specific word. If you will listen, listening to the voice of the Lord your God. You will find almost all through the Bible where it's a question of physical healing and health. The primary condition is what we listen to. God says, if you listen, listening to the right thing. What's that? The voice of the Lord your God. When I was in hospital seeking God for healing, I found this passage amongst many others. And I said to God, what does it mean to listen, listening? And I believe He answered me, I gave you 2 ears, a right ear and a left. To listen, listening, is to listen to me with your right ear and your left. And I realized later how many people listen to God with their right ear and somebody else with the left. Now, if you listen to God with both ears, the result is faith. But if you listen to God with one ear and maybe the devil with the other, you know what the result is? It's confusion, not faith. God says, if you listen to my voice and do that which is right in my sight, when you hear my voice, you'll obey me. And you'll give ear to His commandments. Notice it comes back again to the ear. And in Proverbs 4, incline thine ear to my saying.